She walked up to my table in the middle of a quiet Tuesday afternoon, looked me directly in the eyes, and said, "You look exactly like the father I lost 30 years ago." I opened my mouth to offer some polite deflection. I almost said the usual thing, "Sorry, must be a mistake. I have one of those faces." But then she said my name, not as a question, as a fact. And I understood in that single moment that my life was about to be dismantled in ways I hadn't yet imagined. I thought I was finally ready to grieve. I had no idea I was about to discover that the grief had been a lie. I have been carrying this story for over a year now, trying to figure out where to begin. Because the truth is, this story doesn't have a clean beginning. It starts in the middle of 30 years of silence and works its way outward in every direction at once. I'm telling it now because I believe someone watching this needs to hear it. Not because it ends happily, though it does, in its own way, but because the path it took to get there was something I couldn't have survived without understanding that some miracles arrive looking exactly like catastrophe. My name is Raymond Calloway. I'm 61 years old. I spent 28 years as an environmental law partner at one of Houston's most respected firms, the kind of firm with dark wood paneling and oil portraits and a waiting room that smells like old money and controlled confidence. I semi-retired 3 years ago, not because I wanted to, but because I couldn't sit across a conference table from grieving families and maintain the fiction that I was the person who had the answers. I'd spent too long knowing I didn't even have the answers to my own life. Every few months, I drove to the Houston Public Library on McKinney Avenue. Always to the same section. Grief, loss, recovery. The kind of books with titles that make other library patrons glance at you with careful sympathy. I never finished any of them. I would pull one from the shelf, carry it to a table by the window, read the first 2 chapters, and then sit staring out at the street until the light changed. I was not there to read. I was there to perform the motion of trying to get better. There's a difference. She came from between the stacks on a Thursday afternoon in October. She was maybe 35, wearing a blazer the color of charcoal over dark jeans, her brown hair pulled back tight. She moved with the posture of someone who had learned, not naturally, but through long practice, how to take up exactly the right amount of space. Controlled. Armored. When our eyes met, something in my chest did something I cannot fully describe. Not recognition exactly. Something older than recognition. "Raymond Calloway," she said. "That's your name, isn't it?" I had not heard my full name spoken by a stranger in that particular tone flat, certain, testing in a very long time. The book slipped from my hands. It hit the floor. The sound seemed enormous. I stared at her, my legal mind already cycling through possibilities, finding none that made sense. "I'm sorry, how do you know that?" I managed. She didn't answer. She said, "I didn't drown." And then she grabbed my wrist. And then she said, "We need a DNA test right now." And then my life changed completely. Honestly, if that had been you, what would you have done? I've thought about this so many times. A rational person walks away. A rational person says, "I'm sorry, I think you're confused," and returns to his grief book and his performance of moving forward. But here's what nobody tells you about 30 years of guilt. It makes you irrational in a very specific way. It makes you desperate for any version of events that might mean you didn't kill your own child. So when a woman says she didn't drown, you follow her. You follow her to a medical center 2 blocks away, you give your DNA, and you sit in a white room across from a stranger who might be your daughter, and you wait. My daughter Nadia, was 5 years old when she died, or when I believe she died, October 1994. My wife Claudette was behind the wheel. We had left an Italian restaurant in the medical center area after a dinner that had started badly and ended worse. I had discovered that morning that $60,000 was missing from Nadia's education account. Claudette had a gambling problem. I had known about it for 2 years and had been managing it, telling myself it was under control, telling myself one more intervention would fix it. I was wrong about a lot of things that year. The highway was slick with October rain. Claudette drove the way she always did when she was angry too fast, jaw set, daring me to say something. I watched Nadia in the back seat clutching her stuffed elephant, her eyes wide, doing the thing that 5-year-olds do when they sense that the adults around them are not okay but cannot say it. I tried to smile at her in the rearview mirror. I lied to her with my face. Claudette's eyes found mine in that mirror, and then she jerked the wheel. I survived. Paramedics pulled me out of the bayou after my 6th dive looking for Nadia. They never found the bodies. The official account, shaped almost entirely by the testimony of witnesses who had no reason to lie, but somehow all told the same wrong story, was that I had been driving, that I had been drinking, that the accident was my negligence. My blood alcohol registered at the legal limit exactly. 2 glasses of wine over 3 hours. Claudette had been drinking for 6. But witnesses remember what makes emotional sense, and a grieving wife and missing child made more emotional sense than a drunk husband. That narrative stuck. My law partner, a man named Gerald Okafor, arrived at my hospital room on day 4 and offered to handle everything. He was calm, efficient, and kind in the specific way of someone who is very good at appearing to be something he is not. I was too broken to question any of it. I spent 30 years believing I had killed my family. I spent 30 years paying for it, in the only currency available to a man who cannot be formally prosecuted: silence, isolation, and a recurring visit to the grief section of a library. The DNA results came back 99.9%. The doctor set the folder on the table with quiet precision. I stood up without meaning to. Nadia. I said her name out loud for the first time in years. My voice broke apart on both syllables. I moved toward her with my arms already open because 30 years of grief does not wait for permission. She held up one hand and stopped me flat. Not angry, just distant, like I was a transaction she was completing. She picked up her phone, turned away from me, and said into it, "Confirmed. 14 days, starting now. I'm bringing him to the house." She hung up and looked at me. "Follow my car," she said. "We're going to your old house in Bel Air," and then she walked out. I stood in that white room with my arms still half raised, feeling like a fool. The miracle I had waited 30 years for had arrived, and immediately made a phone call. This is one of those moments where I have to stop and be honest with you, because I think this is the part of the story that most people can connect to, not the dramatic specifics, but the feeling underneath them. You wait for something for so long. You rehearse it in your head so many times that the rehearsal becomes a kind of second life. And then the moment arrives and it looks nothing like you imagined, and you have to decide, do you walk away because it isn't the version you prepared for? Or do you step into the version that actually exists? I followed her car. I followed her across the city toward the house I had sold 30 years ago in grief. I followed her because the 14-day deadline terrified me. And I followed her because even cold and armored and holding me at arm's length, she was my daughter. She was alive, and I would take whatever version of alive I was offered. The house was different. She'd had it remodeled in clean grays and whites, every warm color stripped away. Security cameras in every room. Armed men in tactical gear in the hallways. The guest room had iron bars on the windows disguised as decorative detail, professional, expensive, functional. She locked me in my own former home and presented me with 2 sets of documents the next morning. Power of attorney over my remaining assets. An irrevocable trust transfer for the $80 million family trust my grandfather had established. Sign willingly, she told me, or she had 2 psychiatrists ready to testify I was mentally incompetent due to delusional grief. Either way, she got what she came for. She wasn't wrong that it was airtight. I read every page with a lawyer's eye and found nothing to argue with. It was brilliantly drafted. I found myself almost professionally admiring it even as I understood it was a cage. I also understood for the first time, clearly, that this was not just about money. The money was 14 days away from a cartel deadline. This was about survival. My daughter had come back, not for revenge, not for reunion, but because she was running from people who would kill her if she didn't deliver, and my trust was the only currency she had left. The coldness wasn't contempt. It was the operational focus of someone who had been surviving on calculation for 3 decades. A business card tucked inside my return briefcase changed everything. Claire Navarro, forensic accountant. A Houston number, handwritten. Someone wanted me to find it. I called from my hidden phone during a shift change. "Mr. Calloway," she said. "I've been waiting. The money trail from your family trust runs through shell companies in 3 countries and connects directly to a cartel laundering operation. Your daughter has been moving money for them for 18 months and skimmed a percentage for herself. That was the mistake. The cartel gave her 14 days to return $2.3 million or they'd kill her. She needs the $80 million trust to pay them off and disappear. And she needs your signature or a court order declaring you incompetent to access it." There was a pause. "Your wife," she continued, "is not dead. She's been living in Geneva for 30 years under a different name. She's coming back to Houston. She believes she has spousal rights to half the trust." I had to sit down, not on a chair, on the floor. Claire Navarro met me at a cemetery in the Heights neighborhood, beside a headstone I had purchased for a woman with no body. She spread documents across a folding table. Wire transfer records, surveillance photographs, bank statements from an account belonging to a woman named Celeste Wren, formerly Claudette Calloway. 3 decades of deposits, 3 decades of a life. Gerald Okafor had brokered the sale of my daughter for a $100,000 commission, certified Claudette's death on forged paperwork, and quietly dismantled my reputation while I was too shattered to defend myself. He had been Claudette's accomplice from the beginning, possibly longer. I drove back to the house with the accident file I had never opened. At midnight, I read the investigator's notes. Witness accounts inconsistent with the accident trajectory. Driver's side door found open upon vehicle recovery. Insurance claim filed within 48 hours, signed by Gerald Okafor as power of attorney holder. The driver's door was open. Someone had gotten out before the car went under. She hadn't died. She had escaped. When Nadia found me in the conservatory that night, I slid the investigator's notes across the table without saying anything. I watched her read them. I watched the armor crack. "I didn't crash the car," I said. "Your mother did. Deliberately. And Gerald was there to handle the aftermath." Nadia's hands were shaking when she looked up. "David Gerald," she whispered. "He pulled me out of the water. He said you were driving drunk. He said you had tried to kill us both. He kept me in a safe house for 10 years. He told me you were in prison. He called it protection." She stopped talking. She didn't cry. She looked at the wall for a long moment. Then she handed me a piece of paper, a wire transfer receipt she had found in Gerald's office in Vienna 2 years earlier. The date was 5 days after the crash. The amount was $500,000. The memo line read, "Merchandise, as discussed." She was 15 years old when he sold her. I want to stop here, because I know some of you watching this have experienced betrayal. Not necessarily on this scale, but the specific flavor of it, the moment when you realize that someone you trusted was performing trust while doing the opposite of everything trust requires. And I want to say something about that. The thing that makes betrayal like this so devastating isn't just what it takes from you, it's what it convinces you to take from yourself. I spent 30 years carrying guilt for something I didn't do. Nadia spent 30 years carrying hatred for someone who was being destroyed by the same people destroying her. We were both weapons aimed at each other by people who needed us too fractured to look clearly at what had actually happened. If you have ever been turned against someone you love by a lie, you know how completely it works. And you know that the first step out of it is not forgiveness, it's information. The gala was set for Friday. FBI Special Agent Dorothea Reyes had been running an 8-month investigation into the laundering operation. She needed everyone in one room, Gerald, Claudette, and the cartel lieutenant who had been managing the debt collection, a man named Esteban Vargas. Nadia would wear a wire. I would host. We would sign the documents at 8:30, triggering everyone to reveal their hands on record. Then arrests. Nadia agreed. But she pulled me aside before the briefing ended. She showed me a text thread, a name I didn't recognize. Gayla confirmed. 5 days. She had sent it. I almost asked. She met my eyes and said, quietly, "I know what that looks like. I'm not your enemy." But I needed to know if Marco was feeding information to Vargas. I was testing him. The name on that thread is not who you think it is. I had to choose. In that moment, whether to trust her. Everything in my legal training said, verify. But she was my daughter, and she was terrified, and she was doing the only thing she knew how to do, play every angle simultaneously, and hope one of them held. I chose to trust her. The evening of the gala, our old house, her house now, transformed into something she had built rather than inherited, filled with 200 people in black tie who had no idea they were walking into a federal operation. Nadia came down the main staircase at 7:02 in a deep green gown, and the room went quiet in that particular way that happens when someone enters carrying more gravity than their appearance alone can explain. I was watching the crowd, not her. I was watching Claudette, standing near the bar in a burgundy dress, her face going white when she saw her daughter alive and crossing a ballroom toward her. I was watching Gerald move through the crowd with his 40-year smile, the one that had fooled everyone, including me, shaking hands and laughing with people who didn't know he had spent 30 years building an empire on the trafficking of children. At 8:17, the lights went out. The power cut wasn't just lights. It was cameras, communications, and the grid controlling the FBI's monitoring station. In the darkness, someone screamed. I heard glass shatter a champagne glass somewhere near the bar. Then the first shot, then another. Muzzle flash in the dark, short and precise. FBI agents dropping their catering disguises and shouting. Agent Reyes on the radio, coordinating a tactical response to a situation that had just become a crime scene. I hit the floor and stayed there. I could hear Esteban Vargas moving, not running, moving, the measured stride of a man executing a plan. He had known. He had known the layout, the power grid, the camera positions. 14 months later, in the trial transcript, we learned that Marco Salinas, the man Nadia had been investigating through that text thread, had been feeding him every detail for 6 weeks. Not just the gala plans. Everything. He had been assigned to get close to Nadia 9 months before she contacted me. Everything they'd had together had been operational. I found the parking garage entrance by memory. I had designed the house. I knew where the exits ran. I heard Nadia's voice before I saw her. Stop running. She was steady, too steady. Vargas had his back against a black SUV, his hands raised, smiling, and I understood the smile immediately because I had seen it in 100 depositions over 28 years of law. It was the smile of someone who believes the game is still going their way. Go ahead. Emma, he used a name I didn't recognize. A name they had given her in Prague, become what we made you. Prove it was all worth it. Prove you're exactly what I know you are. Nadia's finger was on the trigger. Time does something strange in those moments. I noticed details that had no business being noticeable. The hum of the fluorescent tubes, the smell of motor oil and cold concrete, the fact that Nadia was not shaking. That was the thing that terrified me most. She was not shaking. 30 years of survival had trained her body to be still in exactly these moments, and that stillness was the most complete portrait of what had been done to her that I had ever seen. She had been made into a weapon. She was holding one, and the man who had helped make her into it was daring her to fire. I walked toward her. I did not run. I did not shout. I walked the way you walk toward something fragile, slowly, making sure she could hear each footstep so nothing would startle her. Nadia, I said, look at me. She didn't lower the gun, but she looked. You are not what he made you, I said. You never were. I know what they told you about yourself. I know you believed it because you had to believe something in order to survive, and that was what you were given. But I have been reading the same story in every grief book in the Houston Public Library for 30 years, and I know how it ends when the only thing left is the anger. It doesn't end. It just changes what it costs. You deserve a life that isn't defined by what they took from you. Killing him won't give you that. It will give him that. It will hand him the last thing he wanted, which is proof that he was right about you. She was crying. I hadn't seen her cry before. Not in the library, not in the White Room, not in the conservatory when she found out the truth about the crash. But she was crying now, silently, with the gun still level. And I understood this was not weakness. This was 30 years of everything she hadn't been allowed to feel arriving at once. The gun came down. I was beside her in 2 steps, and I held her the way I had been holding her in my imagination for 3 decades. Not the way you hold someone in a sentimental memory, but the way you hold someone when you are genuinely terrified you might lose them again. FBI tactical units flooded the garage. Agent Reyes personally arrested Vargas. Gerald was in custody with a shoulder wound and the beginning of a very long legal reckoning. Claudette was already in the back of a federal vehicle, her burgundy dress torn, her expression not frightened, but furious, the rage of someone who believed until the final moment that she was the smartest person in any room she entered. Marco Salinas stepped out from behind the SUV. He looked at Nadia and said quietly, "I'm sorry." She looked back at him and said nothing for a long moment. Then, "You don't exist to me anymore." That's all. Gerald received 25 years to life. Claudette accepted a plea deal, 18 years for conspiracy, fraud, and child abandonment. When she spoke at sentencing, she described herself as a victim of addiction and manipulation. The judge looked at her for a long moment before responding. "You left your 5-year-old daughter in a sinking vehicle and collected the insurance money. That is not a complicated moral situation, Miss Wren. 22 years. I'll be recommending denial at every parole hearing." Vargas received life without parole. Marco, 15 to 20 with cooperation terms attached. Nadia served 14 months at a minimum security facility in the county. I drove there every Saturday, without exception. Every single Saturday. The first visits were difficult. She answered in short sentences. She looked at the table instead of me. She was testing me the only way she knew how, by waiting for me to stop showing up. I kept showing up. By the 12th visit, she asked me why. I told her, "I missed 1,560 Saturdays of your childhood. I'm not missing these." She cried again. We both did, and we started building something out of the rubble of 30 years. On the morning of her release, I was standing at the gate before sunrise. The Cascade Mountains were painted gold behind the city. She walked out carrying a single bag and stopped when she saw me. "You waited," she said. I told her, "I will always wait. That's what fathers do." The Callaway Hope Center opened its doors 8 months later, in the house that had once been a monument to what was taken from us. We removed the iron bars, we painted the walls yellow. We built a playground where the formal garden had been. The first child to arrive was a 7-year-old boy named Tomas, who hadn't spoken in 4 months. The second was a 5-year-old girl named Amara, who carried a stuffed elephant everywhere she went, the same animal Nadia had clutched in the back seat of her mother's car 30 years ago. The first time Nadia saw Amara's elephant, she sat down on the floor in the middle of the hallway and didn't move for a full minute. Then she looked up at me. I said, "Go talk to her." And she did. This story taught me that the most dangerous kind of grief is the grief that has been engineered. When someone manufactures your guilt and then lets you carry it for 30 years, the damage isn't just personal, it's architectural. It shapes every decision you make, every relationship you enter, every room you walk into. The mistake I made was accepting the story I was handed without ever asking who wrote it. Not because I was weak or foolish, but because grief makes information feel irrelevant. What difference does the truth make when the people you love are already gone? The difference, it turns out, is everything. The one specific action I'd ask you to take today. If you are carrying guilt about something that happened in your past, ask yourself one question: did you construct that story, or did someone hand it to you? Because those are very different things, and the answer might change your life. Here's the question I want to leave you with. If someone you had mourned for 30 years came back to you angry, cold, and pointing a legal weapon at your life before you knew the full truth, would you have stayed? Would you have followed the car? Or would you have walked away and called it self-preservation? I genuinely want to know. Comment 1 if you would have followed her. Comment 2 if you would have called the police. Comment 3 if you honestly don't know, because I think 3 is the most honest answer, and there's no shame in it. Tell me in the comments what city you're watching from and what time it is there right now. This channel brings these stories to people in every time zone, every continent, and every kind of situation, and I love knowing where you are. If you've experienced something like this, a long deception, a lost relationship rebuilt from ashes, a moment where you had to choose between what felt like justice and what was actually freedom, please share it below. You might be the person someone else needed to hear from today. If this story stayed with you, please subscribe. Not for the numbers, because there is a child somewhere who is going to be helped by the work that the Callaway Hope Center and places like it do, and the more people who hear these stories, the more that work becomes possible. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss what comes next. And if you know someone who is carrying 30 years of someone else's guilt, share this with them. You might be handing them the exact thing they needed. This is a fictional story inspired by real emotional experiences, fully rewritten and reimagined in Houston, Texas, to create original content. Any resemblance to real people, living or deceased, or to actual events is entirely coincidental.